Last night on our television program, I had as a guest Dr. Marcia Coleman Adebayo, and we had a rather interesting conversation about the history of America. And she said some things that I thought everybody needs to hear. Here's the first. This is, I was talking, we were talking, and and she was talking about we were talking about race, and she was talking about economics. And I pointed out that from the founding of the Republic until the Civil War, the majority of the, quote, wealth in the United States was slaves. And it was. There was no other single source of wealth that was greater than that, and they were, of course, all held in the South. And the South was willing to fight the Civil War over that. And here's how she responded to that. This is clip one. The earliest capitalism in America was the slave trade, and
Exactly.
the largest block of single industry, as it were, assets that were held in the United States from the mid-1600s until the 1860 were slaves.
Well, and I'd rather call them human beings, but if you want to use the word slave, that's fine. I look at the what you call the slave trade really as a human and sex trafficking trade.
Yes.
That's really what it was. And when you look at the history of the word slave, it's actually not used for almost 40 years after Africans arrived in Jamestown. There's a correlation between Africans coming into the United States and when there is a great deal of profit to be made from rice and from cotton, that you see them, the name being, the name that's assigned to these Africans being changed from black Moors and Africans to slaves. And that was a way of stripping off their identity, stripping off where they came from, stripping off any human link that one would have to another human being.
And then we were talking, well, we continued the conversation. Here's another clip. This is, again, Dr. Marcia Coleman Adebayo. I believe that probably 80 or 90% of white Americans could not explain to you what white privilege is. And is that why we're not acknowledging that America has been an apartheid state up until, just a generation ago, and that we've been basically a terrorist state against our own people?
If you don't mind, if I can go back one second for you, because there's an institution that you've missed that's so important to this conversation, and it was called the Slave Patrol. And the Slave Patrol is created about 80 years after the first African arrives in Jamestown. And the goal of the Slave Patrol was, first of all, to surveil, to find out who's moving around from one concentration camp. I know we call them plantations, but they were really concentration camps. Who's moving around from one concentration camp to another? Who's talking about moving from one place, escaping from one to another? And then it was obviously capturing people, because that was a loss to the corporation if that person was able to flee from the corporation. And then it's also providing a level of terror, so that as a deterrent, so that people didn't ever think about moving or trying to escape to freedom.
We don't teach and we don't talk in the United States, and by we, I'm talking largely about the white-owned media, the white-written textbooks, the white power structure in this country. I'm guessing most African Americans understand everything that Marcia was saying, but we don't talk about the South in those terms. That it was a terrorist state, that it wasn't an apartheid state. It wasn't blacks and whites being separated. That happened arguably after the Civil War. In fact, actually, I'd say that arguably happened after 1954. Prior to that, it was still a terrorist state with the Jim Crow laws. People couldn't register to vote, and people could be easily murdered. And to this day, people of color are easily murdered, particularly by authority figures, by police officers in this country, with no consequences. We have to acknowledge that the Confederate flag, which is flying at full staff in South Carolina, while the American flag has been reduced to half staff, that the Confederate flag is the flag of a state, of a nation, the Confederate States of America, that was not that different in many ways from Nazi Germany, in as much as they were imprisoning and killing their own human beings, their own citizens, in these concentration camps that we like to refer to as plantations, and that there was the equivalent of the black shirts and the brown shirts, the slave patrols, which led directly to our modern police departments and also to the creation of the Second Amendment. And I think it's time for for white America, to realize and acknowledge that we, white people, have been committing terror against black people since the founding of this republic to this day, and that this horrible killing the day before yesterday down in South Carolina is just one more piece of that. This kid is a terrorist. The Confederate States of America were a terror state. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
And the conservatives want to dance all over this, and weirdly, a lot of that goes back to Reagan. We'll cover that when we get back, and then pick up your phone calls. It's Anything Goes Friday.